All right, mining towns. I've been to several of them. One, San Francisco, is like a couple hundred miles away from where the gold was discovered. That's an odd one. I think there must be something in between that. But that kind of counts as a mining town because it was built up by mining and the trading of mining. A lot of miners traded their finds in San Francisco as their main focal point, and so it was able to spend a lot of money on itself and build up high-rise buildings and condensed everything real tight on a very challenging geography with the hills the way they were. They still had no problem spending the money to build up that area. Another one is Idaho City, which is a stark contrast. I mean, when you enter the city, it's like they have a sign that say, well, we pulled out millions and millions of dollars from the hills in this area. But today, it's just it's a wasteland. I think it was how people were treating each other in Idaho City that really influenced how it looks today. Compared to Butte, Montana, which is a highly built up area. It's the buildings went up real fast in the late 1800s, and today they're largely abandoned and blocked off. You can't even go in them because there must be a structural damage so much that they can't allow people to safely walk around those buildings without retouch-ups. And then you have Jerome, Jerome, Arizona, which has also built up buildings as well. The interesting thing between Butte and Jerome is they were influenced by the same people. The same people mines both cities. These two cities, north and south from each other, between the Grand Canyon and the Yellowstone Park. The mining exploration companies decided on these two locations, and it's interesting. It seems like almost every hill could be mines in a lot of ways, but specific ones are chosen possibly for owners' rights in a lot of ways. Whatever they felt like they could get the best deal upon purchase. Because no doubt, if somebody knew they were sitting on a mining claim, they would jack up the price for selling the lands. There's also another interesting copper mine just west of Salt Lake City, which is shown. You can see it on the map. It's just this big yellow stain on the map, on the Google Maps, that you can no longer tour. Apparently you could tour it 5 years ago. There's video of it that you could tour. People were touring, were walking on and able to look over, but then they stopped that. I tried riding my bicycle out there and to look, and the gate guard told me he was going to trespass me from the property. And I was like, well, I used to tour this area. So these mining areas, they spent a lot of money on themselves. There's just a massive inflow of resources to those areas. And you could see that in the architecture and the buildings. They spent so much money on the early let's say luxuries of the day, of the late 1800s, early 1900s in some ways, because the copper mining came later after gold mining. Gold mining sounds like a bit of a different process compared to copper mining. Copper mining, they resorted to crushing rocks to separate all the geological pieces, and you see that in a lot of the machines in the museums on display on how this the rock crushing went about. But and I'm sure there's a list of these mining towns that you could check out. I've just kind of happened upon them in traveling around, just run into them, and I see such a big difference in like compared to the cities just immediately around them. They spent so much money on themselves, building several stories tall buildings and with a little extra Victorian style art and stuff. They really had that. I mean, they had to do something with the money, I guess. And in those days, it was harder to really spread the money around like you can on the internet today. So spending it in the immediate areas probably made the most sense. And when they made a lot of money, it made a big difference. And you see that today. But you see the 100 years later what it looks like afterward, when they ran out of money, they left these structures behind. It's like you can't, if they're not nailed, they were pretty much nailed down, so they couldn't take all these buildings with them. They had to leave them behind. And you see from that point of the finished units what happened to what kind of degradation happened to them over time. And between San Francisco, of course, they were able to turn the city into a tourist industry, and so they were able to restore and revitalize a lot of the old buildings there. Idaho City, I don't know what happened. These people were, like, the culture there was very violent in Idaho City. They were killing each other, and people are dying with their boots on, being buried with their boots on, it sounds like almost by the hundreds. There's a lot of pioneer graves. You go to that graveyard, there's a lot of unmarked graves. I mean, there's pioneer graveyards where they can actually identify the people. But you go to the graveyard in Idaho City, and you can't identify half the people in that pioneer graveyard. And a lot of them just have wooden stakes, old wooden stakes. No doubt, a lot of them have been knocked down. I mean, a forest fire came very close to that graveyard, as evidenced by what I've seen. The black char the line came close. And that could have been just a recent one. I mean, we're talking about 100 years. A lot of there may have been other fires that have raged through the area that have knocked down and taken out the grave markers. So you really don't know. You really don't have all the spots marked for the cowboys that died in that area. And that was a violent, sounds like a violent area for claims jumping and disputes and stuff. They would fight it out and kill each other in the northern Idaho area. And that area is still very, very say aggressive today. I experienced it firsthand. I mean, we know about Ruby Ridge. The people there are very aggressive in the northern Idaho area. The people were aggressive in the Butte area as well. In Butte, Montana, they actually had a pretty violent strike at one point during the copper mining. The miners didn't feel like they were making enough money, so they struck and just destroyed all kinds of buildings. But I mean, not so much. It's not so bad that there's a wasteland. So a lot of the buildings did survive. It was more a matter of just breaking windows and beating people up. One guy got lynched in Butte. They have a big sign that says some guy got dragged out and like lynched because he was pro labor, he was fighting for the labor, and yeah, people didn't like how the strikers, maybe felt they were demanding too much. So you got like Idaho City, extremely violent, and they never came together to build a nice area. And maybe the forest fires had something to do with it too. There are some pretty bad forest fires that just happen spontaneously and rage out of control in that area. That could have been a factor in why, you know, even though they pulled out all kinds of money from that area, it never was able to become built up. But east of there in Butte, they were able to build it up really nicely, and they had little disputes. That strike was pretty violent, but it wasn't enough to dissuade the architectural build up. In Jerome, I didn't walk it to the museum. I didn't pay. That cost money. And there were no signs in Butte, there was actually signs outside that talked about the violent protests that was had. One building did get destroyed, as far as I understand, and then they put signs around the wreckage for us to read today and read about it, which I recorded on my Butte videos. But in the Jerome, Arizona, that there's really no sign of any serious fights. You think there probably were some fights. They pulled millions and millions of dollars, like half $1 billion or more. That probably more than $500 million. It's quite a lot. They made millions and millions, and there's a lot of wreckage there too. But it seems like the wreckage is a result of landslides more than people disputing each other over pay and stuff. See, like that's the interesting thing. It's like they were more individualistic in Idaho City. I don't know if any companies actually. It didn't sound like any real companies like came and standardized the workforce in Idaho City. There were people who dredged and stuff, but the dredging came afterward. They had some companies, but the claims sound like they were more individualistic. And for copper, the organization started to really present itself better. Gold Rush, it was individualistic. People were fighting each other. Maybe there were small groups that formed partnerships with each other to bring in bigger machinery so they could dredge the soils in larger quantities. But that individualism was the early start of the mining, and then when they moved to copper, it was more of a corporation that was they learned from the early gold rush days how to better organize themselves. But I mean, they couldn't stop the strikes, at least, and that shows in the architecture of Butte, which is interesting to me. So I don't know if I'm able to talk about clearly enough. There is a difference between mining towns in that they spent a lot of money on themselves early on, and then it just ended. It stopped. And these towns have turned into tourist towns, so you could see what the early development was is kind of like frozen in time in a way. And there's tour buses, of course, in San Francisco. There's tour buses in Butte and Jerome as well. Jerome's taken a different, unique aspect to it by claiming it's a ghost town. Okay, they don't do that in Butte or even Idaho City. There's no tour bus in Idaho City. It's just Idaho City is so run down anyway. It's not even worth it. It's kind of a tourist city, but geez, you start taking photographs and posting them to social media, and the locals will get on you. They got on me pretty hard about that. It's about violating their privacy or something. But you see that there was a large rush. You see the evidence today. There's a large rush to the area, and then just a big drop off when they ran out of what they were mining. They just left it immediately. There's probably signs of that in Alaska too. I haven't been to any mining towns, and it's interesting. I'd really like to see some oil towns to compare, because I've been to lumber towns, lumber cities, and like Eau Claire, Wisconsin. That doesn't really look like it stands out as any rich area, but they made quite a bit of money with wood, but it's nothing like a mining town. There's a big difference, and you see that they selfishly spent the money on architecture. Just they didn't really have any serious building codes, but they were able to successfully make a lot of buildings and that stand today.